Welcome again to PyCon Day 3. It's my pleasure to announce Christopher Neugebauer with his talk, The Death of Consequences. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you. Hi, you've come to my opinion talk. This is a talk I prepared for a different conference, which is slightly less lax on timing. It is going to run long. It's not going to run so long that you'll miss the next talk, but if you're getting antsy, it's okay. You will get time to go to another room at the end of it. Again, my name's Christopher Neugebauer. You may know me from the talk I gave yesterday, or the fact that I host lightning talks, or various other things I do in the Python community. You may have seen over the last year a lot of talks about open source sustainability, the way things are in open source, and I'm here to set the stage for those talks that you've seen. This is a talk about why things are the way they are in open source. Now, how this talk is going to work is that I'm going to start with some background, I'm going to selectively present some evidence, and then I'm going to present the conclusions that follow directly from that evidence. If you're into rhetoric, you will recognize this as reductionism. This is necessary because I have only 30 minutes, which I'm going to use up entirely to try to deliver a clear message. You have been warned. So, the talk. This talk is about the first golden age of open source, which I believe everyone here in this room has lived through, and is now, in my view, firmly and indisputably at its end. Two key events happened last year that I think signal that downfall. The first, which I spoke about at Monktoberfest last year, you can look up the video, stems from us as a community being unwilling to address the false and destructive narrative that being a terrible person makes you a more effective contributor to open source. The result of this was almost an international security incident. The other is that IBM announced that it was to acquire Hashicorp in a transaction that closed earlier this year. This acquisition followed the rejection, first by industry and then by the market, of Hashicorp's decision to relicense their suite of open source tools, notably including Terraform, under non-open source terms that prevented cloud providers that Terraform was designed to interoperate with from offering services based on those tools. Hashicorp's actions were a reaction, like countless other open core companies, to larger, better capitalized companies launching services that competed with their revenue streams using code that they had written. And while it makes sense to fight back against such extractive behavior, the way in which they did so was comprehensively rejected by people who care about open source. That rejection likely caused the drop in share price that enabled that acquisition, a complete failure of an open source product business to operate as an independent entity. And ultimately, the root cause of both of these things are the same. We as a movement have created incentives for people to perform undesirable behaviors. And today, I want to talk about extractive behavior that leads to smaller projects becoming unsustainable, and how we as a movement have actively chosen to incentivize extractive behavior, and how we've thrown away our ability to fight back. So extractive behavior is not unique to open source. Many creative industries suffer from extractive behavior from corporations that are not disincentivized to do so. In 2023, a group of workers realized that their industry was likely to be significantly impacted by the rise of AI, that their work could be used to train AI models, which could eventually be used to devalue their work, or worse still, completely replace their jobs. A threat that we as software engineers feel all the time at the moment, and yet it wasn't the tech industry that stepped up. It was the entertainment industry. Both the writers' unions and the actors' unions for film and television in the US withdrew their labor for more than 6 months in protest to changes affecting their industry and threats that they saw on the horizon. Entertainment productions halted for more than 6 months, but as a result, both these unions achieved long-term protection against their work or likenesses being exploited for AI training without their consent. Collective action is a balance against the power dynamics inherent in employment situations. It's easy for an employer to compel a single employee to perform undesirable work because the employer can threaten that employee's livelihood. By holding each other in solidarity and acting towards the same goals, using the same tactics, workers can impose consequences on their employers for making unreasonable demands. The most drastic form of collective action is the threat to withdraw labor, a strike. The theory behind it, in simple terms, is that collectively, workers demand that their employer materially improve their conditions. This is a form of sacrifice on the part of the employer. If the employer does not meet the demands of the workers, then the workers can instead show that there are potentially worse economic outcomes than the sacrifice that is being asked of them. Collectively, and key to this, is that the workers show that they are also willing to make collective sacrifice. Withdrawing labour means withdrawing the right to get paid while they aren't working. And while they are not direct parties to the dispute, strike action creates inconvenience for consumers of the business that is subject to strike action. And this is why workers need to educate the consumers about the reasons for their action and why demands are reasonable and necessary. This builds understanding and hopefully compels long-term behavioural change. Performing your own education is key because you can be certain that the impacted employers will spend money to make their point of view known, and you have to compete with that. So it goes without saying that this sort of action is devastating for everyone involved. It demands sacrifice. It hurts. It should only be used when negotiations completely break down. But the mere possibility of workers walking off the job for their needs is a strong signal that collectively, workers are willing to make sacrifices in order to create consequences for non-compliance. And so labour organising is built around solidarity, shared sacrifice, and using inconvenience as moments to actively educate the public so that they can change their behaviour to disincentivise poor behaviour by employers. And so we have the FOSS movement, which is made up of the free software movement, which believes that maintaining freedoms of users to use their computers without restrictions is key, and the open source movement, on the other hand, that believes that software produced collaboratively has a distinct technical advantage to software that is produced in isolation. Both movements are collective responses to power imbalances. For free software, it's against developers and distributors of software who prevent users from modifying or redistributing code. And for open source, it's against management who prevent developers from releasing code to be collaborated upon. The success of both of these movements depends on how its participants organize. So let's go through the history of these movements with an organizer's lens. We'll start with the free software movement and the emergence of Copyleft. Free software is, to put very simply, the philosophy that software needs to be unencumbered so that users may freely realize the full utility of their computers. They argue that users should be free to run, distribute, and modify the programs on their computer so that if a program does not do what they want, they can modify it to do so and share those modifications to help their neighbor. The free software movement thought of the need to liberate software as a moral imperative, with proprietary software or closed source software impeding the utility of our computers and impeding the ability of us to help our neighbors realize the utility of their computers. The early free software movement produced two achievements: a technical project called GNU, whose goal was to create a free software operating system. That project largely succeeded in producing free software tools for use with the operating system, but failed to deliver the operating system itself. And the more lasting achievement was the GNU General Public License, which is a copyleft license. If you wish to modify or redistribute software under a copyleft license, you would need to distribute the source code, including any modifications that you make. The copyleft serves as a control on the production and distribution side of software. Developers can only use copyleft parts if their product is itself copyleft. And distributors can only distribute copyleft software if they also commit to distributing the source code along with any binaries. Indeed, if the GNU project in its formative years did all their development behind closed doors. Copyleft was a distribution tool to them. If a distributor broke the license, then GNU had the tools they needed to penalize that distributor. In his talk at LinuxConf EU 2017, Rommel Lefkowitz coined a term, app freedom, which is the argument that the freedom to make your computer do what you want is no longer dependent on having access to the source code. As the means of distribution of complete apps has become more streamlined, it's just as easy for an end user to swap one app for another one that better meets their needs, and often for significantly lower cost than finding someone to modify some free software for you. In the world of app freedom, that is, the freedom to choose a different app that meets your needs better, free software becomes just another option for a user to pick. Indeed, people who decide to commit to free software and only using free software get less utility from their computers than people for whom free software is just one of a sea of options. Take me, for example. This is a Mac. I could be using LibreOffice to write my talks, but I'm using Keynote. If I bound myself to free software, I could not make that choice. And from an organizing perspective, this is actually quite problematic, because in the labor model, workers, employees, and consumers are made all to contend with a moral imperative. In the Copyleft model, only developers and distributors are asked to reckon with the moral imperative of free software. There is nowhere in that model where users are directly presented with a chance to educate themselves as to why they should care, despite the movement being ostensibly about user freedom. So the Linux kernel was the first massive open source project to organize itself online. This is before the norms of sharing and communicating that we're familiar with today were established. Linux wanted developers to organize under the same project. And Copyleft in this example is a stick. It's a stick to put the need to release source code in terms that businesses understood. You do it or you get sued. But it also gives you a carrot. Most large and long-lived code bases exhibit a phenomenon that Rommel called lithification, which is the tendency for software to grow in layers upon layers built on stable interfaces. If your code targets an older and more stable interface, then you have no incentive to contribute it upstream. You can keep it to yourself. This happened with BSD. Linux in those days did not have a stable interface, and so it resisted lithification. If you wanted your kernel driver to keep working, you really did need to have it merged into mainline to ensure that it did not suddenly break. So Copyleft provided useful guarantees as well. If you submit a patch to the kernel, you are protected against someone using your patch that you've contributed upstream in an extractive fashion. If they produce new software using your patch, they have to release it as Copyleft. So the Copyleft side of the free software movement made a tool that was successful in compelling much of the development and distribution side of the industry to release software with its source. And the consequence of focusing on the supply side of the economy was that there was no opportunity to educate the user base. Despite the user-focused rhetoric, free software's success was a labor model for developers. And what's fascinating about Linux is that Linus Torvalds was a second generation of Copyleft users. He emerged independently of the GNU project and instead saw that Copyleft was a good, developer-focused tool to ensure that all contributors fairly benefited from each other's work. Now, Linux emerged in 1991, but that year another notable thing happened. The GNU project had got to the point where they released enough user space programs, but they were ready to release a C library, which every Unix system needs. But there were already many C libraries out there, and there was no real advantage to making it fully copyleft. And so the result was a thing called the library GPL, or the LGPL, which is like the GPL in that if you modified covered code, you would need to release the source code. But unlike the GPL, you wouldn't have to release the source code of your own software that was otherwise closed source. And this makes a lot of sense for libraries that provide no competitive advantage to the author. In 1998, a group of people decided that we should refer to free software as open source, as a way to emphasize the technical advantage that source availability offered developers, and de-emphasize the moral imperative. So the Free Software Foundation, which, remember, successfully created a model to compel developers to produce free or now open source software, but had no real success in compelling user behavior, decided that the moral imperative and user freedoms should become their main focus. And relatively soon after the rise of open source as an alternative justification for making source code available, the Free Software Foundation announced that they were renaming the library GPL to the lesser GPL to make it clear that not all libraries should be licensed under the LGPL. If you as an author want to encourage more developers to release free software, you should license your wares under the GPL so that they can't choose to use your software unless they use the GPL. It was a very highly nuanced read. It spelled out why you should actively think about your license choices, which was put under a headline, why you shouldn't use the library GPL for your next library. And the result of this headline was exactly what you would expect. library developers stopped using the library GPL. However, the result was not the mass migration to Copyleft that the Free Software Foundation recommended. Because following the rise of open source a few years earlier, we started to see a new breed of open source. Developers at product companies realized that they could take advantage of the technical benefits of open source and would release parts of their web apps under open source licenses. This is how we got Ruby on Rails. It was a byproduct of a task tracking tool. This is how we got Django, which was the backend for a newspaper. Product companies, with their newer view of open source as technically advantageous, realized the trick was not to open source everything, but to open source the parts of their application that offered them no differentiation. If every web app needs to talk to a database and produce forms, then you commoditize that code, leaving product developers to focus on what their business perceived as its competitive advantage. In this business model, strong copyleft does not make sense as an option. And that also assumes that developers are even in a position to make the decision to release as copyleft in the first place. And so despite focusing their rhetoric on user freedoms, free software's core organizing model, that is copyleft binding developers without that mechanism to educate users, it saw a real failure. These developers of Django and Rails and things like that were users of open source, and they were embarking on their first large open source projects. These developers were not predisposed to free software, and free software had thrown away its tools to welcome people into the movement. Weak copyleft like the LGPL was the exact copyleft model that translated to these new developers' views of the world, but with the official line being this, then it's no surprise that people looked elsewhere. Django, Rails, and basically every major library to emerge around that time used licenses that bind no behaviors on the licensee other than giving attribution to the original developer. These are the so-called permissive licenses. And binding on licensees is the stick in Linux's organizing model. And these projects decided from the information available to them that it wasn't worth it. And as for the carrot, well, the platform effects of GitHub replicated, for small projects at least, the collaborative effects of the Linux kernel. If you host on GitHub, when you fork a library, it's really easy to stay in sync with mainline. It's trivial to merge from external contributors who make bug fixes. There are mildly punitive behaviors that make it slightly painful to make your code closed source. GitHub charged a monthly fee to take things private. But the consequence of not participating in GitHub's commons was inconvenience. You either spent time or money. And this is, generally speaking, enough to keep most people in line. It does not stop people with means from maintaining their own closed source fork. So by the end of the first decade of this millennium, we really had the basis for what we think of as open source today. The things that generate value or represent competitive advantage should be kept proprietary so that they can be a source of revenue that others cannot exploit. Code that does not differentiate you from your competitor should be open sourced so that you can amortize the maintenance costs across your entire industry. And that you should use permissive licensing because copyleft threatened your revenue and weak copyleft was somehow inappropriate. And so open source code is not revenue generating code. It is a side effect with less need to be protected. And so the model of open source that won was simple. A commons was built out of the code that did not constitute a competitive advantage for its creators. The code you derive economic benefit from would be proprietary. Anything that's open source is a side effect of production. But even though it's a side effect, somebody still has to produce the code. And so that creates perverse incentives. The use of permissive licensing means that consumers are released from all obligation around the code. And so by definition, any consumer of a piece of open source infrastructure is able to gain more economic advantage than its producer because they did not have to do the work to create it. And so when we emerged in the era where open source had won, we had a free software movement that was focused on users that created no compelling reason for its users to participate, but it did create a burden for developers. And we also had an open source movement where businesses that didn't write open source infrastructure were at an economic advantage to the businesses that did. Just let you get that photo. So that brings us to 2012, which is a notable year because a bunch of companies successfully sought venture funding to produce open source tools as a product effort. This was a direction that ignored the successes in open source that had emerged the previous year. They didn't have the product revenue streams of the open source as a side effect movement, and they did this without the tools to organize against extractive behavior by organizations that are not yet motivated to play by the rules. The business model was to release open source code under permissive licenses as their core activity, and then attempt to build value-added services on top of that. What those services were actually going to be was ambiguous at the time. Hashicorp started trading publicly in 2022. That is, they had reached the limit of what they could do with venture capital and instead sought market validation for their products and their business approach. And within a year, they decided that they could no longer meet their owners' metrics of success by releasing permissively licensed open source tools. They relicensed all of their products under a source available license that locked out competitors. The industry and then the market rejected their choice. Their stock price precipitously dropped, and within 6 months, they accepted a buyout offer from IBM for less than their IPO value. And sure, businesses get acquired all the time. But in this case, this created 9.5 years of noise saying that they could go it alone and make this work, producing open source software as a business activity that they projected as being sustainable before the investor demands came home to roost. And there are, of course, consequences to accepting strings-attached money. They couldn't make it work. And as a result, we've lost 10 years of success. We've lost 10 years seeing scores of FOSS-focused startups founded by a meme on the myth that merely receiving money is all it takes to make a project sustainable. And this is what I mean when I say that we're in the golden age. It's now clear that we can't just find money by saying that FOSS is a product in and of itself. We have to rebuild with new assumptions, and it's still not completely clear to me that there even could be a successful business model built around open source as the product. Because as we've seen over the course of decades, we as a movement have made choices to reject economic tools that give us a fighting chance of being sustainable. Indeed, we've seen that we've made a series of choices that every time results in producers of open source having to shoulder a burden that is greater than that of our consumers. If our current model of open source was a business, we would be spending more than we're taking in. We would be trading while insolvent. And because we choose to not bind on our users, we create a situation where our users become our competitors. Licensing without consequences makes us complicit in creating competitors with no external baggage. They don't have to pay to maintain the software that they're building upon, and so they can focus entirely on building revenue streams. Businesses, they do what they're allowed to do. And so if we don't penalize behavior, they're going to do whatever is cheapest and makes them the most money. That's what businesses do. And this is a problem because as a movement, whenever we've been presented with tools to organize and ensure that extractive behavior is not possible, we've chosen the more convenient option without any consideration of the consequences of that choice. And the result is that open source has no inherent reason to be sustainable. And at least that's true for any independent project that hasn't chosen to organize. Which leads me to talk about Kubernetes, which is probably the biggest success in corporate level collaborative open source since Linux. Unlike Linux, Kubernetes is permissively licensed, just like most open source tools that are produced today. So it doesn't have the organizing benefits of Copyleft. But Kubernetes as a project still organizes to ensure that businesses play fairly. It just does it in a different way that businesses understand. Kubernetes is maintained by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is a trade organization. This is otherwise known as a 501c6 organization, which is a sort of non-profit under US tax law that allows member corporations to work together to do work that improves the conditions in which all of them trade. Now that sounds a lot like organizing. The main thing that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation sells are seats on their governing board, which appoints a voting majority of the Foundation's Technical Oversight Committee. And this committee sets the technical direction for its projects, including Kubernetes, and those appointed members ensure that the decisions are made in the best interests of the corporations that appointed them. If you don't pay to join the Foundation, you don't get a say in the technical direction of the project, and even worse, your competitors will be able to make decisions in your absence. Kubernetes has organized effectively. This governance model is sustainable because the stakes of not participating for each individual member organization is made in terms that these sponsors understand. And the proceeds of sponsorship pay for things beyond just governance. Some of the maintenance is also paid for. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation is a properly successful way for corporations to organize around a permissively licensed project with stakes far greater than we as small project maintainers are willing to even consider imposing. And that's the thing, like big tech corporations that are extractive when it comes to small and independent projects organize when it's their own projects. There are consequences for not participating. The corporations that should participate generally do. And when you look at where corporate money and support for maintenance is going, it's not going to the projects that fail to organize, it's going to the ones where there is risk in not participating. Independent projects with permissive licensing generates no risk. And if there's no risk to extractive behavior, they're going to keep on doing it. And that leads us to the point we're at now. We have corporates who understand and have built structures around preventing extractive behavior for the projects that they contribute to. And because we don't stop them, many of them continue to apply extractive behavior. So what do we do about it? Firstly, we need to accept that the tools that formed the basis of organizing back when free software was new have now been completely defanged. The primary threat of Copyleft was fear of being sued by big-name copyright holders. These days, the corporate stakeholders in Linux use the same trade association model as Kubernetes does. Corporate contributors now have at their disposal tools that are more useful to them than the fear of copyleft suits. And because we as a community of independent developers have stopped caring about copyleft, corporations aren't worried about being sued by us and routinely breach copyleft licenses. The single most important test case in copyleft history is taking place in California at the moment. Vizio is a manufacturer that produces TVs that run Linux, and they've failed to produce source code when requested by users. The developers who bind distributors to the GPL have established standing in legal circles to sue to enforce copyleft. But it's not currently clear that third parties have that standing. SFC versus Vizio is a test case to establish standing for third parties. If it succeeds, then owners of devices with GPL'd software can demand that software, like the licenses say they can, from the manufacturer, and they can make a credible threat of legal action if the manufacturer does not comply. And from a right to repair perspective, this would be huge. We would be able to inspect and modify the software that our devices run on. But from the perspective of making open source more sustainable, this achieves basically nothing. It doesn't make a new funder of open source projects. It doesn't contribute development time that would ease the maintenance burden on Linux. It just compels a TV manufacturer to do a bit more inconvenient work. And so while enforcement is entirely necessary, and I donate to Conservancy so that they can keep doing this enforcement work, the fruits of copyleft enforcement are increasingly myopic. So let me revise my statement. Licensing as an organizing tool is dead. Licensing is a way to get what you want through the courts. So unless you have the means to sue every non-compliant actor, licensing will not bring about comprehensive behavioral change. Any movement that founds itself on license compliance is going to be doomed to failure because we as a movement gave up licensing as a socially acceptable way for us to compel non-extractive behavior. Extractive organizations will not take licensing seriously. So what remains for us? The strike action model asks us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice in order to show that we're serious about demands that we have. What could work? As a movement, we've shown we're unwilling to impose consequences in favor of growth as a movement, and we work in environments where there is risk in talking about impeding the revenue streams of our employers or of our sponsors. So let's look to labor. Starting with solidarity and community building would go a long way to making safe spaces for us to even start talking about this. And we need to be willing to talk about what sort of consequences we can impose, because not talking about consequences is what got us here in the first place. As a movement, we're unwilling to impose consequences for extracting behaviour, but we need to work together. If just one project or one community support provider continues to fail to impose consequences for extractive behaviour, then that extractive behaviour is being allowed to continue. And we've seen that the industry and the market reacts really poorly to shutting out bad actors with no remedy. If we create a way to encourage organisations to stop engaging in extractive behaviour, we absolutely need a way to bring those organisations back in to engage in a way that makes the projects more sustainable. And this is one hypothesis for why the market completely rejected these relicensing. It locks out a potential revenue stream or source of collaboration. Terraform's selling point was that it is a better way to deploy to AWS. So removing all chances of them collaborating with AWS was a terrible idea. The technical outcomes of these relicenses are bad, as well as being bad for the business side of things. So I entitled this talk The Death of Consequences, because free and open source software is a movement that is clearly not built on caring about the consequences of our decisions. But not caring about consequences comes with its own consequences. Without questioning the basis on which we're willing to work, then the tools for addressing sustainability operate entirely within the framework that we've laid out for ourselves. Feeling confident about any funding model requires us to ignore the consequences that we've built into our system. Every FOSS developer that we pay to produce software in this system creates more software that can be extracted. And that's how we've reached the end of the first age of open source. If we want a second golden age, well, maybe let's start by not doing it alone. So I don't have time for questions. If you do want to chat to me about this, have an argument, whatever, I'll be hanging around the back of the room or in the hallway for the next few minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christopher. What a compelling and engaging argument you presented. One more time for Chris.